In her 2002 article, Integrating Disability, Transforming Feminist Theory, feminist critical disability studies scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson noted that feminists and disability studies scholars and activists were concerned with many of the same issues and making many similar arguments. For instance, both were concerned with critiques of normalcy, body politics, and reproductive politics. And yet, Garland Thompson observed the two groups were not talking to one another, a fact that Garland Thompson argued was unfortunate for both groups. For critical disability studies scholars, it was unfortunate because theirs is the newer discipline, and in many cases, these scholars were laboring to come up with concepts and to articulate arguments that feminists had already made. They were thus reinventing the wheel due to their failure to engage with feminist theory. For feminists, Garland Thompson argues that the failure to consider disability was unfortunate because disability is an important feminist issue. For one, if we take feminism to be concerned with women and impediments to their equality with men, it is significant that many women experience disability, and indeed, more women than men are disabled. This is in part due to the fact that disability is causally linked to poverty, and women are disproportionately likely to be poor. It also has to do with the fact that disability occurs with old age, and more elderly people are women than men. Beyond this, however, Garland Thompson argued that disability is a feminist issue, even for able-bodied and minded women, because there are commonalities between how women and disabled people are perceived and treated. In fact, Garland Thompson notes that some male philosophers have considered women as a group to be disabled. As she observes, Aristotle defined women as, quote, mutilated males. Women, for Aristotle, have, quote, improper form. We are, quote, monstrosities, close quote. More generally, both women and disabled people have been understood as needy and dependent, and in response, both groups have theorized ethics of interdependence and care. Because both women's bodies and minds, like disabled people's bodies and minds, have been considered deficient in comparison to the bodies and minds of enabled men, or able-bodied and able-minded men, women and disabled people have been and continue to be particularly subjected to medical normalization and body shaming, and both groups have critiqued these practices. Garland Thompson also observes that, quote, enforced feminine comportment delimits women's sense of embodied agency, restricting them to throwing like a girl, close quote. In writing of Throwing Like a Girl, Garland Thompson is referencing a famous article by feminist philosopher Iris Marion Young titled Throwing Like a Girl that examines the phenomenology of women's bodily comportment. To put Garland Thompson's point otherwise, women are socialized to be less capable of or confident in using their bodies in effective ways than men. The feminine clothing that girls and women are often expected and socialized to wear is usually more constricting of the body than the clothing that men wear, making it more difficult to run, jump over things, or climb trees, and little girls are often socialized not to get their clothes dirty, clothes that are often lighter colors, thinner fabric, and more delicate than the clothing of boys. Girls learn not to climb trees because their underpants will show, and not to go in the water because their mascara will run, and not to roll down a hill because their clothing will be stained or ripped. Girls are socialized to try to be small, to not take up much space. All this might be why girls end up throwing like a girl rather than throwing the way that boys throw. Throwing like a boy requires extending one's arm and using one's entire body, taking up space or making oneself big and performing strength, acts which, traditionally, girls have been trained not to do. Throwing is just one example of how girls have been socialized to be less able than boys. We can consider a wide range of ways in which girls have been, and to some degree, continue to be socialized to perform less well than boys, or to be less able-bodied. Not only physically, though, but also intellectually. The consequence of all these differences in how boys and girls are gendered is that girls often end up less habituated to using their bodies and arguably also their minds to their full capacities, less practiced and thus less confident in doing agile things, less confident that they are smart, and more afraid than boys of getting hurt or making a mistake. As a result, Garland Thompson writes, women in a sexist society are physically handicapped. In different publications, Garland Thompson has theorized non-disabled people as normmates and disabled people as misfits. The concept of normate is useful for thinking about both disability and gender. As she defines it, the normate refers to, quote, the corporeal incarnation of culture's collective, unmarked, normative characteristics, close quote. As Garland Thompson observes in Integrating Disability, Transforming Feminist Theory, women are more likely than men to get cosmetic surgery because both gender ideology and market forces enforce feminine body standards that make women particularly likely to aspire to the normate body or to try to make their bodies fit the gendered and aesthetic norms of society. As Garland Thompson writes, this flight from the non-conforming body translates into individual efforts to look normal, neutral, unmarked, to not look disabled, queer, ugly, fat, ethnic, or raced, close quote. This is why both feminists and critical disability studies scholars have critiqued the dominant body politics and the ways in which we are inculcated with a desire to be normal, a desire that has oppressive consequences, particularly for those whose bodies and minds most stray from the normative ideals of society. The concept of misfits is also useful for thinking about both disability and gender because it points to disabled people not fitting into the expectations of society, whether these are expectations of what a body should look like or do, or how a mind should function. Disabled people are thus round pegs in a society of square holes. However, a person who is disabled in one context, the context of square holes, will not be disabled in another context, a context where holes are round or where there are a range of differently shaped holes. Misfitting is thus a good way to think about disability as both material and social, and there are male and straight-dominated contexts where women and queer people, like disabled people, also feel like square pegs. Finally, as Garland Thompson notes, both feminists and critical disability studies scholars are concerned with reproductive politics. However, on this issue, feminists and disability scholars have somewhat different stakes. The stake of feminists in reproductive politics has been to insist that women have the right to decide what to do with their own bodies, and this means both the right to have children and the right not to have children, the right to abortion and birth control. The first part of this, the right to have children, and moreover to raise the children that one has primarily been an issue for women of color, Indigenous women, poor and immigrant women, and women with disabilities, all of whom have been subjected to eugenics, sterilization, and systematic seizure of their children by the state. The second part, the right to not have children, or to limit the number of children that one has been at the forefront of white feminist activism and scholarship. In both cases, the concern is for women to be empowered to do what they want with respect to reproduction, or to have reproductive autonomy or reproductive rights. This concern with reproductive autonomy overlaps with the concerns of disability activists and scholars, since disabled people, both men and women, have been subjected to eugenic sterilization and more generally are discouraged from having children and from raising the children that they have. Another concern that disability activists and scholars have, however, is that within an ableist society, considerable effort and expense is taken to identify whether a fetus is likely to have a congenital disability, and if it is, the assumption is usually that the best thing to do is to terminate the pregnancy. Disability activists and scholars often oppose the systematic practice of prenatal testing and the eugenic ableism that often informs and is reinforced by the decision to terminate pregnancies that would have resulted in a disabled child. There is thus a tension between the opposition to prenatal testing and eugenic abortions that we find on the part of many disability activists and scholars and the categorical defense of abortion rights that is typical of feminism. This does not mean that feminist critical disability studies scholars are anti-choice. On the contrary, feminist critical disability studies scholar Martha Saxton writes, quote, "I believe that at this point in history, the decision to abort a fetus with a disability, even because it just seems too difficult, must be respected. A woman who makes this decision is best suited to assess her own resources, but it is important for her to realize this choice is actually made under duress. Our society profoundly limits the choice to love and care for a baby with a disability. This failure of society should not be projected onto the disabled fetus or child. No child is defective. A child's disability doesn't ruin a woman's dream of motherhood. Our society's inability to appreciate and support people is what threatens our dreams." Close quote. And she also writes, quote, "In resisting prenatal testing, we do not aim to blame any individual woman or compromise her individual control over her own life and body. We do mean to offer information to empower her and to raise her awareness of the stakes involved for her as a woman and member of the community of all women." Close quote. Saxton and other critical disability studies scholars thus do not want to take away women's right to choose or to blame any individual women who choose to abort fetuses that would otherwise have grown into disabled children. Rather, critical disability studies scholars want to challenge the social factors that likely underpinned that choice, including a lack of material supports for parents of disabled children and for disabled people themselves, and common misperceptions that disabled people are bound to have a poor quality of life and that only a special or saintly mother could enjoy raising a disabled child. On the contrary, Saxton notes that, quote, "Many parents of disabled children have spoken up to validate the joys and satisfactions of raising a disabled child. The many books and articles by these parents confirm the view that discriminatory attitudes make raising a disabled child much more difficult than the actual logistics of care." Close quote. It is in this context that Saxton writes that oppression is what's most difficult about disability.